like this, man. He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down in the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's like this old time.
All right, Luthemplaer, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
Hello, curious pixelated man.
Yeah, it's been a really long time since we've talked, and I'm glad to have you back on. As per usual, right? This is I hesitate to say topical, because while we are discussing an item from the news, that isn't really the story, right? We're talking about a broader trend, and what's especially nice is this episode actually lines up, or is about to line up, really well with another episode you and I did about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Highly recommend you look for the most recent episode with Luthemplaer, which is not really that recent anymore. It's like 8 or 9 months, but that will be highly relevant. So, Luthemplaer, welcome back to the show. It's been long enough. You should probably reintroduce yourself, because I don't know if my audience will remember you.
Yeah, I'm. Well, what we could say I am a post-left, filthy Manhattanite Yankee. So your southern audience can hate me properly. Hate me for the right reasons. And to everybody else, I'm just some. What did the Lutheran Church call me once upon a time? A particularly subversive account, or a particularly devious account. Yeah.
I think the funniest thing about that is, despite your name, you are not Lutheran, right? You're
I am
Catholic.
not. I have
Which, I
never.
mean,
I spent a few years exploring Protestantism, realized it was devoid of all legitimacy, and came back to Rome.
Well, this actually will come out. It was separated by an episode or two, but after my episode with Kryptos, where we talked about the Reformation, and I'll put it this way: I have certainly discussed more controversial topics, right? Like, no one's ever been fired from their job for their opinion on the Reformation, at least in the last 100 years. I have gotten feedback, I'll put it that way, positive, negative, all between. And so, what's the best way to react to negative feedback than just keep doing more of it? And so you and I are on to discuss a recent interaction between the Pope and J.D. Vance, right? So there's the slop version of this story, right? J.D. Vance owned by epic Pope Francis, or alternately, Pope Francis owned by, epic J.D. Vance. But there's actually a really interesting discussion to be had here, particularly around the idea of ordered loves, or Ordo Amoris. So I am going to just read out, because it's relatively short, what J.D. Vance said. We can discuss that, right? Introduce the ideas that he is mentioning, and then we'll go into what the pontiff said. So let me pull this up. So Vance says, there's this old school, and I think very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, then you love your fellow citizen in your own country. And after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. A lot of the far left has completely inverted that they seem to hate the citizens of their own country and care more about the people outside their own borders. That's no way to run a country. And I think the profound difference that Donald Trump brings to the leadership of this country is the simple concept, America first. It doesn't mean you hate everybody else. It means that you have leadership. And President Trump has been very clear about this, that puts the interest of American citizens first. In the same way that the British Prime Minister should care about Brits and the French should care about the French, we have an American president who cares primarily about Americans. And that's a very welcome change. So, look, it doesn't seem particularly revolutionary, particularly if you're in our circles, right? But what Vance is sort of obliquely mentioning there is an idea you see from Aristotle to Augustine, again through through the Summa, right? Which is the idea of Ordo Amoris, or ordered loves. And the idea is basically that is what virtue is, right? Correctly ordered loves. So, for instance, right, the idea would be that there's nothing wrong with loving your children, But if you love them too much, right, if they become, an idol in the Christian conception, that can consume you, right? Look at, classical stories such as, Grendel's mother or the Beldam from Coraline, right? The all-consuming mother. And the idea is that is something that is not in it of itself evil, but it is taken to excess. You can also look at this in C.S. Lewis, right? This is a very core idea to Western and Christian thought. So sorry, Luthemplaer, that's been a long rant from me. So I'm curious, where do you want to go from there?
Well, I think I'll briefly focus in on the specific paragraph that people are saying is regards to what Vance said. It's paragraph 6 of the Pope's letter. Christians know very well that it is only by affirming the infinite dignity of all that our own identity as a person and as a community reaches its maturity. Wait, I might have misread that. Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationship with all, especially with the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true Ordo Amoris that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Shepherd. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. So, what are your thoughts on what the Pope said before I go spieling?
So first of all, I'm going to quote Adrian Vermeule, right? Which is, you can achieve a certain amount of medieval piety by simply having no idea what's going on in Rome, which I highly recommend, right? While I am not Catholic, I have certain sympathies. And so I think it's probably best to conclude that, the Pope has done nothing wrong. He was merely led astray by wicked men. But in all seriousness, right, effectively, this is a very fundamental disagreement about Christian love and charity. Right, what Vance is putting forth is a limited version, right? A version tethered to reality, which is, we live in a world of limited resources. We also live in a world of responsibilities, and all responsibilities are not equal, right? You owe more to some people than to others, right? You owe more to your family than to your neighbor, and more towards your neighbor than, a countryman from across the globe, right? Someone who lives 3,000 miles away. And that does not mean, right, that you should be cruel, or if it is in your capacity, to help someone, you shouldn't. But it's this idea that, the world is limited. You only have so much attention. And also, right, the bonds in your life, right, the ties you have are real, they matter, and they require something of you. And they require something more of you than just general humanity, right? The things that divide humans, right? And I realize that term has a certain moral weight to it, right? Well, they do bring significance, right? The reason that there are, different tribes and peoples, well, that isn't just an accident of history, right? That is kind of like the rightly ordained order of the world, right? That's the way things ought to be. And given that, right, how do you act in a world where you don't have the power to make everything right? Well, effectively, choices have to be made. And this is something I'm actually going to take a brief aside. I highly recommend George Bagby's Telegram channel, right? Bagby's Corner. It's really insightful. There's really no topic. There's no way to respond to it. You just get his posts, right?
Yeah, Bagsby being Orthodox is a nice special third thing to listen to.
Yeah, and I will say, George Bagby is my favorite Orthodox Christian on the internet by a mile after recent run-ins. But nonetheless, right, I don't want to be needlessly punitive. But one of the things he talks about is how often people, particularly Christians, get wrapped up around this idea, right? Well, we ought to, be equally nice to all people. And on his face, that's an appealing idea. But that's not how anyone lives, right? As if you know anything about Bagby, he taught in different private schools, right, where you had to pay a certain amount of money to go there. And one of the things he would always say is he would ask people, like, well, why, ask students, well, why did your parents send you here and not my kids, right? Why aren't they, if all kids are the same, right? If you have an equal moral weight to everyone, why not, give their money instead of sending their kids to school here, why not to mine? And the answer to that is actually very obvious, right? Well, they're their kids, right? They care about them more. And that doesn't mean that they hate anyone else's kids. It's just a simple fact of life, right? People have these kind of concentric rings of loyalty. And I think that in a weird way, right, this is, and not to get too like autistic and, Scottish enlightenment about this, but this is, an is versus ought distinction, right? What is the world like versus what do I wish the world is like? And, it is not simply just a matter of, practicability, which is certainly there, but it is also that this is a very well supported idea in the Western canon, right? This is not some new thing that J.D. Vance came up with. This is a very old idea. Sorry, Luthemplaer, that's my second multi-minute rant. And I guess this is supposed to be an interview show, so I'll throw it back to you.
Well, so there are a lot of things going on in the overall Pope's letter. I would center in on the word concentric expansion and gradual maturing. And so on principle, I don't necessarily disagree with the letter. I kind of view it more as disconnected from the reality on the ground. Like, it provides a nice ideal to aim for, but I don't think it's necessarily practical in terms of the government. And given that the state and government is divided in America, I wouldn't inherently find a contradiction in Catholics caring for people on the way out. The Pope has said a few times that there's no requirement for you to keep people in your country, but you do have a requirement to protect them from death and injury. And this is like a kind of like, I think I'll be the devil's advocate and say it's not insane to ask this of Christians and Catholics. I still want them deported. I still want like 30 million less foreigners in my country. But I don't want it to be this like Gestapo-style mess that will give our enemies moral justification to attack us in 20 years. I think if it's done in a clean and orderly fashion with like minimal propaganda value to our enemies, that it can be more permanent. And so like on these grounds, I'm not going to like contest what the Pope said. But I will say that it is detached from the reality on the ground in terms of like the degree of suffering that we've had in this country. And it's like Catholics can disagree with the, they can disagree with the Pope to a degree where like the Pope is like just not acknowledging certain facts. I'm still going to call him I'm Catholic and I'm still going to call him the Holy Father. And for whatever reason, I don't dislike the call to sanity and cleanliness in this necessary action, and I want to emphasize necessary action.
And this is something there's actually been multiple American Catholics who've made this point. Tom Homan is Catholic, and as you can imagine, he's been asked this question multiple times, and what he said over and over again, right, is closing the border saves lives, right? That there are people who drown crossing the Rio Grande. There are people that are killed or brutalized by the cartels, people who are, sold into human trafficking that are enabled by, the porous border. And, obviously the primary motivation is not to, we're not closing the border for the sake of citizens of another country, but this is a genuinely mutually beneficial thing where, the citizens of America do not need nor want this. And also, a great number of people are, experiencing insane human tragedies. And then at the end of it, right, they basically become a slave class, in America. And to be honest, I feel quite comfortable in the moral argument that I don't want to live in a country run on slave labor. I think that is bad. And, in a broader context, I actually quite like what Vance has done here because he is using strong moral language to talk about this issue. Like, I know we talked briefly about the kind of like practical side of this, and while that certainly matters, the conservative movement has really been swamped by numbers and figures, right? Reducing everything to kind of like the great American spreadsheet. And to be honest, no one cares, Paul Ryan tried to do this almost 20 years ago. Not quite. 10 years ago and got absolutely nowhere, right? Because there's no narrative and there's no moral weight to it past just, spend an arbitrary amount of imaginary dollars, doing something else. Whereas here, right, this is being rooted in something deep, something true, right? This is something that, if people thought about, they'd kind of instinctively recognize is true. And, justifying it in that kind of moral language, I think, is a very interesting development. And it speaks to, and look, I've been critical of Vance for a number of things, right? But it speaks to someone who actually has done a good bit of reading and, has indexed with ideas older than the 20th century.
Yeah. And that's probably the most, I'll just say I'm pretty sure Vance follows me on an alt, because while I lock my account from time to time and post some bangers, kind of just to test the waters of like who follows me and where's something of a banger going to end up. And I was writing about St. Augustine's Ordo Amoris while locked. And some things Vance said were word for word what I said, and not to claim too much credit. I'm not the shadowy figure behind the grounds, but he follows a lot of us, I think, on Twitter, and does take the opinion. Like a lot of us have read a lot of these older writers. He probably follows you, Jay Bird, and he probably recognizes the things you say, and I do think he's really taking the pulse of America's, I'll say, new intellectual class, the more like the theory cells, and trying to say how can I turn this into a popular message that will I think he's seen that the message is valued by Americans because it's so much more pointy towards our culture than what the left has been offering. And he seems to be he's copied different writers that we know. He's copied from Moldberg and such. But I do think he's attempting to tap into that older writing style and philosophy that can actually build a nation up rather than divide it. Because at the end of the day, you have to recognize one of the things that politics is that it's kind of like a social nuclear energy, where the only way for political power to be extracted, I think you've said this, Jay Burden, the only way for politics to extract energy is to divide collections, like groups of people. In that divide, politics extracts this energy through nuclear splitting of communities, basically. You might have said this actually at one point. And
yes, I think
Vance
that's one of the few original ideas I've ever had on this show. And by original, I mean I just stole it from Joseph de Maistre and added a 20th spin on it.
Yeah, and we should be looking out for if he quotes de Maistre, because if he starts quoting de Maistre, we know he's serious, because only serious people read de Maistre. He's such a freaking word cell. No, I think that the way in which Vance has framed it is going to be something that the left can't really tap into, because most of them are illiterates at this point. Another thing to recognize is that what the Pope usually does is he responds to requests for comment. And so the Pope would have only been reading the rather left-leaning bishops of America and their criticisms of the president and the vice president. And so he would have a limited frame coming only from the bishops. The guy is dying of bronchitis for the last month. I'm pretty sure he hasn't been paying attention to the actual politics in America that much while in the hospital bed. And there is a very real likelihood that this Pope will not survive the Trump presidency. He's near the end of his life, and he's not all there anymore. So many times what he says gets interpreted by people in the Vatican and in America's bishops. I actually was going to attempt to read the Italian and Spanish versions of this to see if there's any linguistic differences. Something that you have to pay attention with letters from the Vatican. The English translator, whoever they have doing it, is not a good translator. He's done mistakes and inserted words before. I don't know who it is who does the translations, but he has a record of misquoting the Pope. And if you go to the Latin, Italian, Spanish, it's oftentimes different than what the English is getting. So I have some concerns about that with what the Pope is saying, because the Pope has in the past said no, you have to deport criminals, you have to manage your border. He in interviews where he was directly present. So this letter, while in the spirit of the Pope, does seem to be a little distant than what he usually says in these issues. Like the Pope's general message on this topic has consistently been, you can't kill people, you can't torture people, you have to take care of people, but you also have to like deport people who are criminals. You have to like do the work of a state. So the Pope has often said these things, and so I'm wondering to what degree there's an actual disagreement between Vance and the Pope versus a framed, invented disagreement of like passing dialogues that haven't actually interfaced with each other.
Well, and funnily enough, this is actually a point that Thomas makes, right? Who is no papist, I'll put it that way. That effectively a lot of the Pope Francis dialogue is complete and utter nonsense, right? Like for instance, there was a big interview with him and some Italian journalist a while back, where he allegedly confirmed his support for gay marriage. And if you look at the actual sourcing of it, the guy didn't take notes and just kind of made up the interview afterwards, which
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I can't decide based or cringe. But nonetheless, right? And I think a lot of this is, it becomes kind of grist for the mill, right? That the culture war is most certainly, raging through the church, right? And I don't just mean the kind of like, capital C version of that, right? Like all different versions of Christianity. And one of the interesting things about this is you see how often reason becomes a slave to the passions, right? Because if you look up the phrase right now, J.D. Vance, Ordo Amoris, you will get a lot of very stupid articles from people who obviously care nothing about Christianity or really only learned about, Augustine yesterday, right? Or whenever, Vance made that tweet. And, very clearly it is people kind of willfully misreading that, right? Turning that into kind of a straw man to attack. And look, I'm not saying like, I don't want this to come across as, too pro JD Vance, right? I certainly have my criticisms of him. Although I will say what's interesting is I have a number of sources, right? And several of my sources have glowing reviews of JD Vance, right? Saying like he's everything we think he could be, which is great. I would love to be proven wrong.
Yeah.
And I think I may be. But, it's so interesting to see an issue get pulled into the political discourse, kind of taken apart and then like regurgitated into kind of like a political, I guess, like motive force, right? Be angry about this thing. If you like Augustine is, I would say, I don't want to say non-political, but like firmly out of the realm of politics, right?
Well,
Like
he's very political for a system of politics that no longer exists.
Exactly, right? Like, can you literally remember the last time someone from the 3rd or 4th century came up in American political discourse, right? It's almost laughable. But, because, either evil bad man or, JD Vance, our Lord and Savior, brought it up, it is kind of lent a new life to the issue.
Apart from he said, she said, it may be valuable to spend like maybe like less than 10 minutes on like what the Ordo Amoris is.
Why we honestly, if I were a better podcaster, that's what we would have started with.
Yeah. So I had I can do a quick review as a good Catholic boy, and you can give the Protestant spin on it if you want.
Yeah, technically Protestant. Yeah, deeply closeted.
We call you guys there's a term for you guys. I'll think of it later. Like Protestants.
What do you mean, you guys? There's
like the ordinariate. We call you guys the ordinariate, which are Protestants who refuse to submit to Rome but end up agreeing with everything in the long run anyway.
Wow. No, I don't feel special anymore. I guess I'm just part of a group.
It's just a term we have for Protestants who are like that. It's it's like an in-group term. There's an official office for it. Anyway, so Saint Augustine was writing at the end of the Western Roman Empire. Rome had been sacked, and he was in North Africa. He was a Carthaginian Roman. So he spoke a unique Roman dialogue of a unique Latin dialogue in a unique area, and it's important to recognize that Augustine faced the end and didn't survive it. Augustine died when the Vandals sacked Carthage, or sorry, not Carthage, whatever city the Romans built by Carthage over its ruins. I still call it Carthage. It's like the same thing basically. But Saint Augustine, he saw the fall of Rome. He recognized it was the end of an era, and he took to writing things that Christians could use in the next era to come. And I have a personal fascination with these people that exist on the borders of eras and recognize that they are on the border of eras. Like that, I'm Catholic, but I like reading Luther because he is, in his works, he's fully aware and he acknowledges that he exists at the border between the medieval era and whatever's coming next. And at least in his Genesis commentary, he tries to preserve medieval scholarly understandings of Genesis so that the next era would at least have a piece of the medieval view of it. I like Augustine because he's at the end of the Roman era and the start of the Gothic, like Dark Ages, basically. I don't believe in the term Dark Ages, but that's the accepted parlance. So I prefer the term
Hey,
late antiquity.
Luthemplaer, let me just go back to what you previously said. If
Yeah.
you had to bet money where Saint Augustine of Hippo died, where would you say he died?
Hippo.
Yeah, I think we're both stupid because it took me a
No,
Wikipedia page to figure
well,
that out.
Hippo is right by the ruins of Carthage. It's
No, you're
basically
right. I just thought it was funny.
yeah. I know. Hippo is basically where people that survived Carthage moved to after it fell. Anyway, so he was writing like the city of God, because like Rome was something called the divine city, and once it was sacked, it was like the fall of Rome was kind of like the fall of Jerusalem for the Jews. It was like the end of this like era of feeling like you were immortal. It was the 9/11 of the Romans, if you will. And I'll say the first sack in 410 that Augustus is writing about was not at all that violent. Like no one actually, at least it doesn't seem like anyone actually died in the sack. Arlec came in, demanded gold. He was a Roman general from a Gothic background. Again, he wasn't really a barbarian. He spoke Latin. He was a legionnaire commander. And he's like, I need money for my soldiers, and you don't got it. So let me come into Rome and take the gold off the pagan temples. When he entered Rome, he had the population go into the churches and stay there while he ransacked the pagan temples. And he took the gold off the pagan temples. That's why Rome doesn't really have any pagan temples left, because Alaric essentially put them in a furnace and turned them into gold coins. So Alaric's siege of Rome was not a terribly violent event, but it was the spiritual death of the city. Anyway, so in one of his books, I think the City of God, Augustus outlines what he calls like the Ordo Amoris, which is Latin for the orders of love. Now, it's a common misunderstanding that the orders are a scale of how much love you give to others. It starts as that, but what it really is a map to where you start with your love being focused, and as you mature as a Christian, there is an overflowing of love that flows into the next category. This is what the Pope was talking about in terms of like you're not supposed to stay in these concentric circles. You're supposed to mature as a Christian, and as the love overflows, you pour it into the next category, with the goal being that eventually, when you're like a holy saint, you can love everyone equally because you have the strength to. You're not like expected to enforce that on other people, just guide them in like a passive way. At the top of this order is the amore Dei, the love of God, the supreme love, where you start from. Like the fear of God is the beginning of faith. And this holy dedicated love unto God is pure and focused on the things that God is concerned with. So in this process where you begin as a Christian, you focus your love on God, and the light of God will shine on your darkness and reveal to you your sins through the Holy Spirit and where you need to work on. As you start to conform to the image of Christ's perfect love, then the love overflows into the amore sui, I can't do Latin very well, which is the love of self. This love of self, reflected from the love of God, perfects the love of self to gird against sin and reform yourself into a saintly character, so that once you love God rightly and love yourself rightly, then you have the spiritual girth, if you will, to move into things beyond your internal world, in your spirit, in your soul, in your mind. So once you as a temple of God are rightly ordered and built as a proper temple of the Holy Spirit, then you can lead others. This is in principle taking the plank out of your eye before you point to the splinter in other people's eyes. And again, it's not that you're not Jesus did not say to ignore the splinter in other people's eyes. He said to take out the plank in your eye and then help your neighbor take the splinter out of your eye. So libtards who want to say you can't talk about other people's sins, no. First, you talk about your own sins, humble yourself, and seek your own perfection. Then your love becomes the dialecta proximi, proximi, or the amore proximi, the love of kin, family, and society, your neighbors, your immediate neighbors, the people you see all around you in your day-to-day life. Not on the internet, the people you interact with in real life. In an equivalence, the ancients wrote about not reserving your love for the letters you write to others. So, like, their version of the internet would have been books and internet and letters and stuff. Rather, to your physical neighbors in your community. This love, ordered correctly, has you taking care of the poor amongst you where you find yourself in your neighborhood. From this poverty and lowliness, you can start to raise up people, because now you have the strength to take something of a leadership role. Not really yet, because you're not like you're not a priest in the Catholic perspective, and in the Protestant perspective, you're not like a prophet or something. You're just a churchgoer going throughout your day, seeking the kingdom in your neighborhood. The temple that God has built in you can start to spread to your neighbors. Now, within the Amoris, hiccups. Within the dialecta proximi, there's a subcategory, the love of, amore familia, amore proximi itself, and amore fraterni. These are loves of your kin, your family, people that you share blood with, and then your neighbors. And then fraternity is people you consider brothers. This is what the Pope was specifically talking about when he said fraternity. He was speaking actually about the outer love, not the primary love, which is an important distinction that the Pope made that is being overlooked by many people in criticizing the Pope. The love of fraternity, which we'll say specifically, this is things like friendship, fraternal love amongst brothers, like I said. It reflects the caritas, not merely utility or pleasure. So the world has a tendency to treat friendships as a source of utility and pleasure. The Christian love is to take an invested care in those you are building a fraternal order, if you will, with. For people like in this community, that would be your friends online. So you have to treat the people you know online as like an outer peripheral. Stop building your dependencies on people you never meet in real life. It's technically a call to get the fuck offline and get a real life. Touch some grass. So the forgive my language. The Amoris Proximi is really something to think about. Like, what are you building? Really, it's Amoris Fraterni, Fraterni. I forget my Latin shit. So, this fraternal love should be open to all people, to people that you aren't related to nor neighbors to, but people that you come up across. A good example that the Pope gives is the Good Samaritan who saw the injured Jew and decided that he would be fraternal to him. He would take the injured Jew to a Jewish doctor to take care of him. The Good Samaritan understood the Ordo Amoris because he didn't bring the injured Jew to Samaria. He brought the injured Jew to a Judean doctor. So he... I
just wanted to say, listen to our episode on the topic. It's quite good. But, there's an interesting thing in this, right? Which is an equivocation, and you see it among, I was going to say Christians, but really just Western people generally, which is a conflation of the idea of virtue and niceness. Actually, this is something that C.S. Lewis gets at, right? Where he's talking about the classical refrain of, well, why should I go to church if there are perfectly nice people who don't go to church, and there are mean people I don't like who do, right? And his whole point is that the virtue, right, the point of human existence, right, the well-ordered life is not synonymous with just being pleasant, right? Because that's a very like easy, low thing to do, right? It requires really just not rocking the boat, doing things that most people agree are, tolerable. And that's not the same thing as virtue, right? Virtue is a commitment to something bigger than yourself, right? Not just to the kind of like things that are easy for you to do immediately. And I think that you see that in this debate as well, right? Which is like, well, what is the nicest thing to do? Well, here's someone crying. They want to come into the country. Let them in, right? They stop crying. But the problem is, right, that is not ultimately the thing to do, right? That is not the ultimate good, right? That's the same thing as, if your kid is crying in the grocery store, so you buy them a cookie, right? Like you're solving the immediate problem, but ultimately your motivation in that is selfish, right? It is, I want to relieve a certain amount of emotional distress. But the problem is, in each example, you're not actually making that person better, right? You were increasing their personal wealth, their personal well-being, right? There, if we take an economic view, their number of utils, right? But the problem is, right, there are real externalities of that, right? You were basically, to assuage your personal feelings, creating a problem for someone else, right? In the case of a kid, you're making a monster that's going to make yourself and everyone else's life miserable, and theirs as well, right? You're creating a spoiled kid. In this case, right, you're basically disadvantaging the poorest in your own country, right? You're creating a slave class. You were, undercutting wages. You're doing things that like genuinely matter. You're basically, mortgaging off your posterity. And so the idea that, the height of Christian virtue is just to be generally pleasant or nice is something that's not borne out, right? Look at the example of Christ himself, right? Well, we can certainly say like, oh, he ate with Pharisees and tax collectors and prostitutes, and that is true. But also, he cleaned out the temple, right? He rebuked the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He called them, whitewashed tombs and dogs, let alone what Paul did, right? Like, I'll put it this way. Read Hebrews. Paul was not a particularly pleasant person, right? In the way we would conceptualize it, right? He had very harsh language. And so if you take scripture seriously, and actually, I don't know if you know this with Luthemplaer, I have recently been accused of turning scripture itself into an idol, which is a very bizarre thing for someone to say to me, because I don't know if I really talk about the Bible all that much. But anyway, just an aside. Sorry, what's that?
I'll just finish with the last two categories, and then I have.
Oh yeah, sorry. Another rant from me.
No. So after these loves that we mentioned before, Augustus writes that there is a further out circle, the Amore Civitas, which is the love of society, civic and political love. This is where he defines the Civitas Dei, the city of God, and the Civitas Terrenia, which is the earthly city. So this is like the separation of church and state. And this love is where you start going into people that aren't like you. So it's essentially what Augustus is saying is like, you really shouldn't deal with people that aren't like you until your community and family and kin groups are rightly ordered, serving God. Like the attention has to be locally before you have the spiritual capital, we'll say, to overflow it into those that aren't like you. And here we see where the left reverses the divine order, where they focus only on the love of civil society, and the last category, the I don't know the Latin, but the love of enemies. Whereas Augustine says, no, your love of enemies and those not like you in the society, that comes once your people group and your families and your community and neighborhoods are rightly ordered. Like I think at one point Paul said, like, you really shouldn't be giving me money until there are no poor amongst you in the church. I forget where Paul said that, but like, give only what you can after you've given to your own church communities. Again, this is something American Christians have completely backwards understanding of, where they'll give like the parishioners money to some random village far away, while there are still people who with drug and alcohol addictions in their church, poor and broken families. The love of God has to go locally first, so that you as a group, as a church, as a neighborhood, as a family, can like share your resources with those further away. It's not to say you shouldn't care about these people, and it's not to say you should never do anything for these people. It's to say, open your freaking eyes and touch some grass. You're like 40th ranked in like education. Half your families are divorced, broken. 30 countries on addictions and drunkenness. These are things that have to be taken down and fixed first. Then, as a nation, you can start helping other nations find God, because clearly you haven't found God yet. Anyway, the last category is the love of enemies, and this is really like the outer area where like you should deal, like the Bible has a pretty strict saying that like, the kindness you show enemies is a weapon. It's like pouring burning coals on them, because your enemies don't expect this, but it's a good way to make disciples. We have plenty of examples in recent and faraway history. I'm thinking of like um Lord Niles, the guy on Twitter. Like, he showed kindness to his captors in Al Qaeda, and now he's a diplomat between the UK and Afghanistan, because he understood the orders of love, and he was a prisoner of war who decided to take a Christian approach to the Taliban, and now he's friends with the Taliban and able to interface with them. This is a Christian virtue that has oftentimes built entire nations because of the right ordering of your loves. And depending on your context, these loves can shift. Like, if you are a POW, you're probably going to be showing love to your enemies primarily while you're a POW. That's just the reality of situations. Like pay attention to the context you are in. It might be an outer circle of the Ordo Amoris, but it is the one you are primarily interfacing with at the time. I wanted to finalize this last little thing with I mentioned, I think, also in our Good Samaritan talk, but like the prophet Oded in the Old Testament in 2 Chronicles 28, he's actually who the Good Samaritan parable that Jesus, he based it off of this story in the Old Testament. Essentially, an army of injured Jews comes to the border of Samaria. And the prophet Oded says, like, the Lord God of your ancestors was angry with Judah and let you defeat them. But now he has heard of the vicious way you slaughtered them. And now you intend to make the men and women of Jerusalem and Judah your slaves. Don't you know that you also have committed sins against the Lord God? Listen to me. These prisoners are your brothers and sisters. Let them go, or the Lord will punish you. Don't bring these prisoners here. We have already sinned against the Lord and made him angry enough to punish us. Now you want to do something that will increase our guilt. And so Prophet Oded, rather than taking in the refugees, Prophet Oded, they gave the clothes and sandals to wear, gave them enough to eat and drink, and put olive oil on their wounds. Those who were too weak to walk were put on donkeys, and all the prisoners were taken back to Judean territory at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then the Israelites returned home to Samaria. The Israelites, Samaria is Israel, Judea. This is after the Civil War, so Judea and Israel are divided. Samaria is just another name for Israel. There's an important context here that, like, the prophet Oded recognized the dignity of these prisoners as human beings, that, like the Pope said, but he didn't bring them into the country. He gave them what they needed, like the Good Samaritan brought the injured Jew to a hospital, and then he walked them to Judean lands to get taken care of, like the Good Samaritan. There's this story in 2 Chronicles 28 is essentially where Jesus gets the Good Samaritan parable from. And it's important to recognize the details. You have an obligation to take care of people that come and ask you for things in terms of hospitality. You do not have an obligation to take them into your lands and take on a burden upon yourself. The burden is like making sure they don't die and making sure they get home, not in housing them in your countries and making them part of your society as a slave class, as Oded warned against.
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? And one of the things that you've seen recently is a lot of predominantly very progressive church leaders absolutely flipping out about the defunding of US aid, right? Of kind of like the non-military arm of US foreign policy. And one of the interesting things about that is that oftentimes that is justified in high-flung moral language, right? Feeding the hungry, curing the sick. And while it certainly does that, right? Again, there are massive externalities to this, right? Really, the fact that, and I'm realizing this is a massive continent that I am overgeneralizing, right? But the absolute stagnation of agriculture in Africa due to the immense amount of basically cheap, ready-made foreign cereals that flood into the country is a great example of that, right? You have countries, many of whom have, fast ballooning populations that do not have, the resources to feed themselves. These ballooned populations are propped up by, cheap foreign food. And not only do they not have the ability to feed themselves so that if, those foods went away, we would see massive famine. But on the other hand, right, you have people who really have, no, I guess, ability or interest in feeding themselves, right? They are not farmers anymore. They either mill around, they do other things, but no one is involved in, feeding that country. And so if there were a shock, right, you no longer have an agricultural base, at least in any way. You can see this as well in the way that U.S. charities, many of them Christian, give clothes to Africa, right? So there are quite a lot of places in Africa where there is no local industry in creating garments, because why would you create garments when you get airdropped pallets of Walmart T-shirts, right? And those are two examples, one much more serious than another, right? But this is not sustainable, right? You can't have a country that is just entirely dependent on charity forever, right? And because, again, right, that is to a certain degree, charity is a good thing, right? But at a point where it becomes dependence, right, where this is not, a real sovereign country that can do things for itself, it is simply, like a giant like receptacle for charity. Well, who is that benefiting? Right. Well, we know who it's benefiting, right? The people at the Pentagon, certain, NGOs, right? They are certainly benefiting, but the citizens of America aren't. The people who live there, well, in the short term, certainly are, but in the long term, right? These countries are not being made better, right? They're being, kind of artificially fluffed up. It's a short term, it's a very narrow version of charity, and to lose that battle, right? To cede the moral ground to the people who are interested in just kind of the thing that makes them feel better is a huge tactical loss.
Yeah, and like it's important to recognize that like God will judge us for like making these people dependent on us to the degree that they are functionally a slave class even outside of our borders. This is not a good thing. If we are punished from God and have a period of drought, they're going to die because of our inability to plan ahead, and they became a dependency class. We as a nation are starving and dying now and have a major problem, and that's going to start to have ramifications externally eventually. Like I just can't emphasize this enough. Like we can't operate as a moral nation knowing we've made foreign countries dependent on us to live, let alone like progress anywhere. Like I would say the more moral way of doing this would be to like start training people on the ground there to do these things rather than just cut them off. But like this is just like, it's going to come back to bite us in the ass when the money and food runs dry and these people start starving and having revolutions out of, the leading cause of revolution in history is a famine. Almost every successful revolution in history happened because of a famine. It comes down to food and circuses at the end of the day, and you lose one, you lose the empire, basically. Like there's going to come a time, and it's probably happening now, when it is happening now. African nations are starting to revolt and fall apart because the food is even now starting to dry up, primarily because we have monoculture crops. The fertility of the soil is decreasing, and a lot of it's going to fuel as opposed to food, corn dependency. And we're not going to be able to feed these people forever, basically. You don't want 1 billion people starving in a continent. That is a recipe for vast revolution that will be seeking vengeance against you. And we won't be able to isolate ourselves at that point. They will be actively trying to attack us in every way they can. One fuck up in Liberia or Syria or Iraq has caused like dozens of terrorist attacks, and those are small countries. Imagine an entire continent out to get us. We just will be facing a cataclysm. That's just a little final thought on that. But ultimately, I guess final thoughts, because we're running out of time, is like the right ordering of loves ensures that the blessings God gives you do gradually spread out. The outer rings of the Ordo Amoris are not a lack of love. They're not supposed to get less of your love. They just get the same love later on after you've met your immediate and local needs. And that takes time. When this country has healthy marriages, healthy civitas, healthy kin groups and families and neighborhoods, when we're done with opioid addictions and weed and cocaine and drunkenness, when we're no longer a nation of prostitutes and drunkards, then we can start reflecting on the outside needs of people that have less than us. But right now, we are not number one anymore. We're falling down in every demographic and trend and every category of education, wealth, ability, opportunity. We aren't number one, so we shouldn't be expected to be number one in this period. Let China and Russia fill up the groups. And the Defense Department will say, "Oh, you're giving America's leadership to other countries." Like, yeah, because we're not leaders anymore, and we haven't been for a while. Open your eyes and look at the reality of the situation. We're a failing nation, and Trump alone is not going to be something that turns that away. You as a citizen have to take some ownership of your declining empire and fix it. Otherwise, there won't be anyone to give all this stuff to around the world, and everybody will suffer.
All right, Luthemplaer, we are fast coming up on time. This was a really enjoyable show. And I've mentioned, I said it was our last episode. It's actually 2 episodes ago. Episode 194, where we talk about a similar subject. Highly recommend it. It's one of the few episodes that I myself have listened to multiple times. And actually, it's kind of crazy. This episode's actually doing remarkably well even now. Like it went out May 4th of last year, and it got like 50 downloads in the last month, which is kind of crazy for something that old. So I highly recommend it. Go back and check that episode. You've been on my show a number of times. Some of my favorite conversations are ones you and I have had, especially in those early days. But if people want to find you, what's a good way for them to do that?
My Substack, you can link it in the video description, elf@substack.com or something like that. Don't go to my Twitter. It's just shit posting.
Well, I will, if I can remember how to spell your Substack, I'll find it. I have a number of complaints with you, most of them demographic and genetic. But primary is why do you spell everything that way? Anyway, enough on that. As far as my stuff, you can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support us, you can either do that directly with the links in the description, or you can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. This is the Axios integration is going quite well. It's about 20 of you guys who came over directly from the Jay Burden Show, and the chat's always a lot of fun. Everyone's kind of posting their workouts, posting their progress. And if you want another way to make fun of me in person, right up face to face, as you will, sign up for Axios. You might even get fit. Again, Luthemplaer, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.